Language is such an important tool and factor in the spread of culture and information, isn't it? Even though in my video over haplogroups, only 9% of people thought that language was the defining factor for various communities. As I've mentioned in the past, language is generally a pretty good indicator of not only a common ethnic identity, but also a common ancestral lineage and close genetic relationship. Linguistic politics are still a huge deal in much of the world, such as Canada, especially Quebec, which is why, to this day, a huge chunk of Quebec's population refuses to learn English, mostly due to a legacy of distrust and conflict between the Anglophone and Francophone Canadians, and in history, forcing conquered groups to learn the dominant language and prevent them from spreading their native language and culture to their descendants was one of the most powerful forms of ethnic cleansing and assimilation, which is how such groups as the Russians, Arabs, and Han Chinese were able to conquer and spread out over such vast stretches of territory. So what would it look like if we were to divide the modern world into various countries based purely off language families? Most of the videos I've made over this topic usually concern some kind of historic or political precedent, such as the unification of the European Union or ASEAN, or come from a more ethno-nationalist or religious approach, such as the union of the Slavic or Islamic worlds. But in today's video, we'll take this topic from a different approach and discuss the ramifications if every single linguistic family were to become various countries, no matter how ludicrous such a scenario may seem. After all, if anything, these types of videos are merely interesting thought experiments, not realistic situations, and the closest I've ever come to doing any video over this topic would be what it would look like if the Slavic world united. And trust me, I definitely want to revisit some of the other scenarios featured in today's video in the future, but for now this will be more of a brief overview rather than an actual historical analysis, as I do for other such thought experiments. Technically, the definition of the various language families is a bit debatable at times, as we could group together some established and universally recognized language families such as Kartvelian, East Caucasian, and West Caucasian simply as the Caucasian language family, and even though this is a bit controversial as not all linguists agree, for the sake of convenience we'll have to group some of these smaller and in some cases even larger language families together, as there are roughly 150 language families worldwide, including isolates, and 1,000 to 6,000 individual languages depending on the definition. Likewise, we'll have to establish some criteria for building the borders of one of these monstrous abominations of a country, and hence, because migration has so thoroughly scattered people throughout the globe, we will divide based off which language family has the highest percentage of first language speakers in an area, and not allow for any enclaves in another territory that is less than 15,000 square kilometers and a population of less than 100,000, so we don't have countries looking like Swiss cheese. Even though there are so many language families in the world, by far the largest in terms of population and area inhabited would be the Indo-European language family, with over 40% of the human population speaking an Indo-European language natively. This would truly be the world's only global country that I imagine the vast majority of people watching would belong to, spanning not only the traditional Indo-European homeland in Eurasia from Ireland to Sri Lanka, but also encompass other areas all over the globe and on every continent. Spreading out from the steppes of Eurasia, the Indo-European country would be divided between the European and Indo-Iranian sections in the Old World, and this could be known as Indo-Europa or alternatively Eurindia. And keep in mind, we could divide even further among language subfamilies such as Germania, Italia, or Slavia, but we'll save those topics for another video. Eurindia would have approximately 3.4 billion inhabitants, about 45% of the population of the planet, and this includes over 1 billion people in India and 1 billion people in the Americas. The top 3 native tongues in this Goliath of an empire would be Hindustani, followed by Spanish, followed by English, with these 3 adding up to nearly 50% of the population, and the population would be extremely diverse racially speaking, as although nearly all people who speak an Indo-European language have at least some ancestral origin in the original forebears of the proto-language, because they've spread out across the earth, their descendants have admixture from all kinds, from the mestizos of the America to the Assamese of India or the inhabitants of the Cape in Africa. For the Sino-Tibetan languages, a country now known as Sibet, China, Yeah, let's just stick with China. This would, of course, cover the bulk of the PRC, Taiwan, Myanmar, and parts of Northeast India, Nepal, and Bhutan, and would have a population not all too dissimilar from the PRC now, nearly 1.5 billion, still nowhere near the frontrunner. The Austronesian-speaking region is actually composed of many different groups, all with wildly varying appearance and genetics, but all retaining a common underlying culture and language, and is, along with Eurindia, the most widespread country, having territory in Asia, Africa, and all over the Pacific, ranging from places closer to Oceania or the Americas. The Pacific inhabiting peoples are divided between the Melanesians on the mainland of Papua and a few island chains, and are about 75% Papuan in genetic origin, the Micronesians in the northernmost islands of around 40% Papuan origin, and the Polynesians, who are the most dispersed, inhabit the largest chain of islands from Hawaii to New Zealand to Tahiti, and have around 25% Papuan admixture. Especially in Fiji, Guam, New Zealand, and Hawaii, the Austronesians of these regions may have recent ancestry from Japanese, American, British, or Spanish colonizers, or more recent Asian migrants, and in the case of the latter two islands, these groups no longer widely speak an Austronesian tongue as a first language, and in total Austronesia would have approximately 440 million inhabitants. Next up would be one of the more interesting cases of the Afroasiatic family, which also encompasses a wide and very diverse area, including Arabia, the Levant, Egypt, Sudan, the Maghreb, and the Horn of Africa, and would have a population of over 500 million, and with the exception of small pockets of Christians scattered throughout the region and a huge chunk of Ethiopia, Afroasiatica would be overwhelmingly Islamic, the most Islamic linguistic country in today's thought experiment. Bordering this extreme country would be the Nilo-Saharan homeland, otherwise known as Nilotica, which would comprise much of Chad and the surrounding regions, South Sudan and parts of Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, having a population of roughly 54 million. Further south of these would of course be the Niger-Congo country, which could just be called Nigeria or Niger-Congo since it covers West, Central, and Southern Africa, with a population of 770 million split between Muslims and Christians at a ratio of about 3 to 5, and would cover such diverse countries as South Africa, Kenya, or Senegal. Now, a Dravidian country, known as Dravidia or Dravida Nadu, is one of the few cases where there actually is a small secessionist movement for the unification and independence of the Dravidian-speaking people, and one of the main reasons that South Indians prefer to use English rather than Hindi as a second language. A Dravidian country would encompass much of southern India and northern Sri Lanka and have a population of about 265 million. Nearby in South and Southeast Asia would be the Austroasiatic country, centered on Vietnam and Cambodia, but with several enclaves in South Asia in accordance with our earlier guidelines, as Austroasiatic people migrated to South Asia thousands of years ago, assimilating many of the native peoples, and this would give a population of roughly 120 million. Next to this would be the Thai Kadai country, centered around today's Thailand, branching out into Laos, Myanmar, and southern China with over 100 million people, which is a scenario which actually almost occurred, as during World War II, Thailand invaded and annexed many of the Thai-inhabited regions surrounding it. Now is where we get to some of the more controversial choices, as due to time constraints and convenience, I decided to include the Altaic language family, a disputed group consisting of the Turkic, Mongolic, Tungusic, Korean, and Japonic families in one country, spanning all of Eurasia from Anatolia to the far reaches of Siberia, with a population of roughly 390 million people. Although the Altaic connection is rejected by many linguists, there is a pan-Turkic movement in many countries in Central Asia and the province of Xinjiang in the PRC to a certain extent, and it is quite remarkable how a tribe of Siberians from the Far East were able to conquer and assimilate such a huge amount of territory. Another linguistic country centered around Siberia would be the Uralic-speaking regions, or Euralia, comprised of Hungary, Finland, Estonia, and other areas of northern Russia in a highly fragmented region of roughly 20 million inhabitants, as the spread of the Russian Empire saw the conquest and assimilation of many Uralic and Siberian peoples in this region. Speaking of which, we would also have the Caucasian region, comprised of most of Dagestan, Chechnya, and Georgia, about 10 million people, with the Russian Empire having expelled many of the Western Caucasians, such as their Circassians, from the region many centuries ago. A few other smaller linguistic families are the Hmong-Mien, a group of around 8 million in their homeland in southern China, the Khoisan of around 500,000 centered in Namibia and Botswana, and of course the Basque, although less than 1 million people live in the region where Basque is still spoken natively. When it comes to the indigenous languages of Oceania, it would be a difficult enough argument to make that the immense number of Papuan languages have a common origin, let alone the Aboriginal languages of Australia. But if we were to include these two together, we arrive at quite an interesting looking country of roughly 12 million people, although again, including Papuan and Aboriginal languages together is criminal at the very least. Now we arrive at the indigenous languages of the Americas, which in North America we can divide between the Eskimo Aleut languages, an area slightly smaller than the continental United States, yet with only 200,000 people if you can fathom that. And beneath that would be the Na-Dene and Algonquin linguistic countries in northern Canada, a very large area indeed. Other Amerindian language countries in Middle America would be the Uto-Aztecan of around 4 million and Mayan of around 10 million inhabitants, and in South America we would have the Quechua-Maran, Amazonian, and Mapuche countries located in the interior. And honestly, if I wanted to, this could have been an hour-long video, but I'll leave some of the more interesting scenarios for future videos. So for today's poll, let me know an interesting linguistic irredentist scenario you'd like to see in the future, and as always, thank you so much for watching. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.